Now, our IFORS President, Grazia Speranza, will begin the webinar for us.
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And welcome to everyone here today. Welcome to this fourth IFORS Global Webinar, which today is dedicated to the North American societies. Let me just start by reminding everyone that IFORS is the umbrella organization whose members are the national societies in operations research. IFORS has 54 member societies, which are organized in 4 regional groupings: NORAM, ALIO, Euro, IFORS. Before going into more detailed information about the webinar we are having today, let me inform all of you that the conference that was planned for 2020 in Seoul, South Korea, has been moved to 2021, to the end of August, and it will be virtual for all except those living in Korea. The conference has already 2,000 participants, and the possibility of submitting an abstract is still open. So I invite all of you to have a look at the website, which you will find through the IFORS website. Thank you, Christy. You can move on. This is the administrative committee of IFORS. We work all together to organize the different activities that IFORS takes care of. In particular, yes, Christy, you can move on. In particular, the committee has decided during the pandemic of last year to organize these IFORS global webinars, which have become an opportunity to get together and to get to know each other better. Where each other means, in the IFORS view, to get the different communities of IFORS to get to know each other. The South American community, the Asian community, the European and the North American communities. So we decided, please Christy, move on, thank you. We decided to organize these webinars dedicated to the different communities, thanks to the work of the 4 vice presidents of IFORS, which you see here highlighted in red. Each of them is responsible for one of the communities. And the first 3 global webinars were organized by the VPs which represent the South American, the Asian, and European communities. And if you are interested, you can find through the website the recordings of the webinars that took place in July, September, and November 2020. The webinar of today is dedicated to NORAM, to the North American community. And it's my pleasure now to give the word to our VP representing NORAM, Carla Hoffman. Please, Carla, thank you for doing this.
Carla, you're muted.
Sorry, everybody, I had been muted. I am Vice President of NORAM, which consists of 2 large organizations, the Canadian Operations Research Society and IFORS, the Institute for Operations Research and the Management Sciences. Both societies are relatively large, run lots of conferences, publications, and other activities on their own, and very much support the global community through IFORS. Today, NORAM is sponsoring the IFORS webinar on sustainability and operations research. And I'm very excited about this webinar because it really relates to all of us. I am going to introduce these speakers. The organization of this webinar will have 3 speakers and then a panel discussion. We've really allocated a significant amount of time for that panel discussion because I think these issues are relevant to all of us. And I hope that you will participate in this panel discussion and make it a truly exciting morning. And so to begin, I would like to give as much time as I can to the speakers, and each of these speakers deserves a longer introduction, but I'm going to make these short to provide more time for both their talks and the panel discussion that follows the 3 talks. I will first introduce Elise Miller-Hooks. Elise, it is my pleasure to introduce you. I should let this community know that Elise is the new editor-in-chief of the IFORS Journal on Sustainability Analytics and Modeling. She will tell us more about this new venture of IFORS. Elise is also the Bill and Eleanor Hazel Endowed Chair in Infrastructure Engineering at George Mason University. She has her degrees in civil engineering. She served as program director at the National Science Foundation and has been on the faculties of the University of Maryland, Penn State, and Duke University. Her research covers many technical issues related to sustainability and infrastructure modeling. She is especially interested in resilience, quantification, and protection, passenger and freight transportation modeling, including real-time routing, scheduling, and management. And she studies the processes of collaborative and multi-objective decision-making. Elise, I am sure that everyone is very excited to hear your talk today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Grazia, for organizing this. I am really excited about our new journal. It's a joint venture between IFORS and Elsevier, and the journal is called Sustainability and Analytics and Modeling. And the goal of this journal is to publish journal articles that tackle global challenges through analytics, mathematical modeling, and OR. And I'm very excited to be the first editor-in-chief of this journal. For some reason it wasn't moving. So the aim of this journal is to publish articles that develop and apply quantitative methods, analytics, and OR to take on these global sustainability challenges. The journal has its aim and scope are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which have become quite popular. And you see the areas that we've divided the topics into. We are seeking to publish articles that are quantitative in nature, but that address these types of applications. So we're looking for articles that are quantitative in nature, create a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that cause these sustainability challenges, provide situational awareness or prediction, that uncover knowledge about what creates these issues, that develop potential solutions or policy recommendations, and all of them quantitative, though, in the way that they go about this. So my personal goal is here in taking on this role is to create more than just the journal, but rather to bring together experts in analytics and OR from across the globe to work toward overcoming these challenges that we are faced with worldwide. And so we'll do that through the journal, but also through workshops and through our work together. So I'm really hoping to use this as a vehicle to form a global community. I'm very excited about working with Sibel Salman and Majid Sarvi, our associate editors, for the journal, and I'm hoping to expand the pool of associate editors by 1 or 2 to represent more of the globe. So also we are in the process of forming the editorial board. So I'm taking nominations and self-nominations. A number of people have been writing to me, and please feel free to do so. I'll give my email address at the end. So we're seeking In doing so, we're seeking balance both globally and across the application areas. So I can include more people if I have more people from every area. So recommend people as well if you're, particularly if you're coming from Europe or NORAM, because I need people from other areas as well. Okay, so expectations for the editorial board members are to serve as reviewer and prioritize your reviews for their journal, to help promote their journal, to help build this community that I'm hoping to build around this journal, and to put forward ideas for and promote special topics. We have 2 websites you can go to for reaching that journal and for submitting your articles, which we'll be very excited to receive. And my email address is really easy. It's miller@gmu.edu, so you should feel free to write to me. So today we have a very relevant topic for this session of sustainability and OR. And we'll be talking about what will seem like diverse applications from the pristine waters of the Arctic passageways, from response to hazardous materials, incidents in Chengdu City, and disruptions in medical supply chains, one topic that could not be more timely. And these works are all tied together through the use of analytics and OR to investigate and aid in these difficult, important sustainability challenges. I'm going to begin by giving my talk on modeling shifts in worldwide maritime flows in a changing global landscape. And this picture is something I really love. It's of the Richard Matheson, which I understand has been decommissioned. It is taken by one of the shipmen who was on a ship commanded by one of the partners on this project, and this is moving through the Arctic passageways. So the project that I'll be talking about is a piece of a larger project from the National Science Foundation in the US, and it is in their program called Navigating the New Arctic. Our project is called An Expanding Global Maritime Network, Its Arctic Impacts and Reverberations. It is a team effort. It's a really large project, and it is over 5 years. We're in the 2nd year now. It involves George Mason University, Ares, a nonprofit, University of Washington in their Polar Science Center, the Maine Maritime Academy, and also a consultant from the University of Alaska at Anchorage. So we have heard in the news that the Arctic is thawing, and this is, of course, very problematic. But it also creates new opportunities. It creates opportunities for resource exploration and exportation, as well as new routes to support global trade. So this leads, this melting of the Arctic passageways will lead to increased passage of commodities through the Arctic region. We're already seeing some of that, not a lot, but some of that. With the movement of cargo through the Arctic, we can also expect greater industrialization of the Arctic, and we can expect impacts that reverberate globally. The larger project is divided into 5 key areas. What I'll be talking about today falls under thrust 1, where we're trying to estimate the flows through the Arctic. So what can we expect to see under different sea ice and weather scenarios for the future? The second is work that is done by my colleagues, or led by my colleagues, Celso Ferreira, Thomas Ravens, and Jin-Lun Zhang. The 3 of them are working together with their students to develop high resolution ice forecasts and meteorological forecasts into as far as 50 years from now. We'll use the scenarios they developed in our mathematical models for predicting the flows. We also have coastal dynamics and such things as maritime infrastructure for cold climate. We have an anthropologist, Anne Garland from Ares, who is leading our work in looking at the threats from shipping industrialization on the indigenous people and their cultures and well-being. And we have Sarah Cobb, who is leading efforts on conflict analysis and resolution, which of course you can imagine will be big in the Arctic. So what is this all about? I love this picture I grabbed from the web because I think it really helps us see this from that global perspective. It's about shorter routes. The routes through the Arctic will be shorter. And here you see the 2 passageways that are more viable at this time, the Northern Sea Route being the most viable, the Northwest Passage that goes around Canada and North America, and then there will also be the possibility of going directly through the North Pole. I'm so sorry. I unplugged that and I thought that would stop it. No idea how to stop that. It's unplugged, so I have no idea what else I can do. So I'm very sorry. Okay, so we have sorry for that interruption. So we have here a picture of the volume that we're talking about, the really the large quantity of passages of ships through the ocean and through the oceans and through our seaports that you can see. This is back from 2007, published in 2010. More recently, we were able to estimate about 60,000 cargo ships are in the world's fleets. So there are some techniques that have been developed in the literature that have attempted to look at global flows and predict, or at least estimate what global flows might look like. We don't have the data for this, it doesn't exist. So we need to figure out how to try to estimate this. And the two most relevant works are listed here. They are somewhat simplistic in some of the ways that they do things, and I won't be able to go into that here, but they also only focus on what's called liner shipping, that is container ships. Our work, we're using a mixed integer linear programming approach, and we're combining both liner and bulk shipping, which is quite important, particularly for the Arctic passageways, which are at this time expected to serve primarily bulk cargo. Why does it matter that they've only looked at liner shipping? It's because, why it matters to us is that the bulk cargo is very significant in quantity. So we see that as a percentage of volume, we're looking at something like 78% of the world's cargo. This is, I think, 2016 data. And the percentage by value is still close to 30%. So this is important cargo to count. In terms of having a global maritime network on which you can apply a mathematical model, there's been a number of works that have created such networks. They can be divided into three general areas. The first are highly aggregated networks, so they might have a single node representing an entire continent. There are some works that focus and have more detail, are focused on trade routes or a small region. And then there are those that are more detailed, but they include and use proprietary data, typically for a particular company, and they don't share the data. So we don't have the ability to recreate the network, and it would only be a part of the global network anyway. All of these are only focused on liner shipping. In our work, we're trying to create a global shipping network for both liner and bulk services with open source and updatable data that we can supply so that everyone will be able to use the network for their research. So in developing our mathematical model, we need that network representation. We have ports represented by nodes. We have service routes. And we have links that are used to create those service routes. And we have legs that are task-based. So here you see a leg would start at port E. The ship then continues through a transshipment activity through port D and then unloads at port A. That EDA is the, what we call a leg in this. And I'm stressing this because the leg flows are the key to the model. So here are our key decision variables, and the most important one I want to stress in this talk is the units of flow of, along the legs. Those units of flow along the legs can then be used to estimate port throughput, which we're going to use in the calibration of the network model. So here is our strategic cargo routing model. In our objective function, we minimize the total cargo shipping costs, including transit costs and handling costs at the ports. In the constraints, we have our largest ship type that can be supported by any seaport. In other words, when you bring a vessel into the seaport, it must be deep enough in those waterways and navigation channels to support the size ship and the draft of that ship. We have a relationship between leg and route flows. We have transits restricted by available transits of vessels. So what the student did in creating this and building the model, her name is Wenji Lee, is that she looked at the number of vessels that are out there that use these routes and their size and how many transit they make in their schedules to assess that. And then we have flow balance constraints and seaport capacity. So that, how many containers, for example, can be unloaded or unloaded in a particular amount of time. Non-negativity and integrality. So we have this mathematical model. It's a mixed interlinear program, and now we need the network to be able to do something real with it. Wenjie has divided the work into 4 data objects: OD, origin destination data, port data, route data, and vessel data, and has used these sources to collect this information. Collecting this information has taken almost a year, maybe even longer. So this is no trivial task. In some cases, even just understanding routes between ports, she has had to work more than a month and doing a certain number, pulling a certain number per day based on the limit that she was allowed to pull each day. But all of this data was, at a cost of like almost nothing, if not nothing. So then we developed the global maritime network to include the containerized, the dry bulk, and the wet bulk cargo. And the specific vessels under each of these categories are also listed. So our network contains 73 container ports, 47 bulk ports, and 41 that serve both types of cargo, for a total of 161 ports. When she created this by looking at the specific routes of the top 3 container or liner shipping companies and their routes, and pulling out the ports from those routes by hand to find 114 such routes, and then use the top bulk ports by volume, the top 100. Some of them were really container ports, and then the rest fall under both. And so that's where we get the 161 ports from. Now we've developed 4 subnetworks to represent the routes themselves. The first subnetwork represents the liner network with 100 container shipping routes from the liner shipping, the top 3 alliances from the liner shipping routes of those companies. This represents over 80%, I think something like 88% of the shipping routes. And then 3 bulk subnetworks that have to do with the bathymetry of those routes, and so that it affects the vessel draft that can be handled by those routes. And so we have 3 of those, under 12 meters, 12 to 18 meters, and 18 to 28 meters. These are then all combined to one global maritime network, which is important to do because they share port capacity and navigation channel capacity, which is taken account of in the model. Here, returning back to those decision variables, we're looking at leg flows. The leg flows can then be used to estimate the port throughput. That QP prime is then key to our calibration effort. So we're calibrating on the port throughput. When she collected the port throughput data for each port of the 161 from their individual websites, and then we use the mathematical model to get that port throughput. We compare it to the published values, and we seek to minimize their difference. We do this using an approximate gradient descent method from Lin and Huang from 2017 that estimates these pies. The pies are then fed into our model. They are the weights on the cost function for transit that are in the objective function. And so then we get a new estimate of the Q, and we repeat in this iterative process. So you see the solving, our model is now embedded in the calibration effort. We have our first run results, which I'm extremely excited about because the network is quite large and it took a long time to get our first result. We only got this 2 days ago. And this is only from the first run of the Maritime network model. We did not do the calibration yet. We're in the process of doing that. So we get the first map, you see what it looks like, and we get the port throughputs that are shown by the size of the circles. Then you see also the leg flows shown here. So what will happen is we'll calibrate and get the better estimates, and then we're going to compare them hopefully to real world data, not just from the port throughput, which is how we calibrated, but from the leg flows that I'll explain in a moment. So the next steps are to use this model to estimate future flows through the Arctic passageways using those scenarios that I mentioned from our ICE team. And this can affect, this will help us understand the effects on local economies, on the pollution of the pristine sea-based habitats, and so on. And to do this, we need to model costs and risks in the Arctic passageways. We are including many of the costs already with transit fees and port handling costs, but there are costs that are very important and specific to the Arctic that are mentioned here. the insurance is a really big one. And then we need to incorporate the risks of going through the Arctic, which come from the ice, from the storm surge and bathymetry and visibility and weather that we're predicting out. So we looked at where in the model do we incorporate those risks. And so we're looking at from the icing, from the climate and geography, and from the weather. And we looked at specific parts of the mathematical model that will need to change. We may also need to deal with uncertainty. The other thing is in looking into the future, we are forecasting over a very long horizon. So we also would want to look at demand volatility, port development. So we may have new ports develop or expand, and vessel carriage. So there are new vessels that come out. They could be even larger, and they take years to build them. And last, I just want to mention work by Hadi Gayumi, who's also in my group. And he is working with the AIS data that we are able to get through our project. This map is showing you AIS data plus satellite data. The AIS data is only land-based, but the data gives us static information, dynamic information as the ships move, and then also voyage information like the ship's draft and other information about the specific vessels. And Hadi calls this the 2P challenges: preparing the data and processing the data. And this is huge here, and I think important to the work that all of us do. We can get the data for the world, but it's extremely expensive. So we are not able to afford this. And that data is nice and cleaned up for us. So we have to go the back way and do this free. So Hadi's been working to process that data. The other problem is we're talking about big data, billions of daily records, and storage issues, and a framework for analyzing it that is really tough when we look at something that large. And last, I want to mention with this data, we can use it to calibrate based on the leg flows rather than on the port throughput, or we could use it to validate, which is what we're thinking to do now that we'll have calibrated based on the port throughput. And then we can also do analysis on this data directly. And with that, I want to say thank you to the US National Science Foundation for funding our team, to Wenji and Hadi for their very, very hard work, and to my fabulous Navigating the New Arctic team. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. Clearly, these global problems are important and extraordinarily complex. And it's very clear how OR is everywhere in your modeling efforts. For those in the audience, please provide any questions and comments in the question and answer area for both Elise and the next few speakers. What I would like to do now is introduce our next speaker, Vedat Verter. Vedat has spent much of his career as a professor of management at McGill University in Canada and has recently joined the College of Business Administration at Michigan State University. He is most interested in analyzing challenges in the public sector. He studies service supply chain design, hazardous materials logistics, healthcare operations, and issues of sustainability. His work has culminated in a very large number of research publications, as well as providing important advice to government policymakers. He is concerned about evidence-based policy design and providing incentives in the areas of remanufacturing, recycling, and recovery management. Thank you, Vedat, for agreeing to give this talk today. Vedat will now be talking about coordination in emergency response system design and application to hazardous materials transportation in China. Vedat, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Carla. Thanks for the very nice introduction. Thanks for the invitation. And of course, Grazia, thanks for your leadership. And I'm honored to be with the other two distinguished speakers on the same panel talking to this very important group across the globe. Today, I want to present our work that has an application in Chengdu City in China. Of course, I'm joined by Dr. Peng Hu, who is from Southwest Jiaotong University, and Dr. Zhang Zhao, who is an assistant professor at Guangdong University of Technology. This work would not have been possible without their integral involvement at the locale where we have actually developed a case study. Going into the motivation of the work, it relates to very common knowledge and observation that most of the emergencies, not just hazardous materials emergencies, but almost all emergencies require a coordinated response. I mean, when you have a traffic accident, you see, police, ambulance, and fire show up at the same time. Now, these kind of service systems relate to what we call a covering problem in the operations research literature. And all of the early work on the covering problem, which aims at maximizing the amount of cover or service you could provide within a threshold time to a certain event, is maximized. Now, however, I mean, so this literature has been around for quite a long time, but when you dig deeper into these prevailing works, you will see that all of them focus on providing coverage with one type of service. So the fact that you need coordination among different types of services in providing cover has not been really studied. Turning into, and this was an important motivation for us. And of course, in terms of our focus research, we looked at the rather mature literature on hazardous materials transportation, and realized that there isn't that many papers focusing on the emergency response side, and the ones that focus on emergency response side, which I show a sample here, are focused on other dimensions, other important and relevant dimensions of the problem, but not necessarily the coordination dimension. So for example, they focus on whether the network over which we're providing coverage is rural versus a highway network, or goes through an urban region, or they differentiate between the type of decisions you need to make in this context, such as the covering, location, evacuation, and routing decisions. But again, the type of coordination decision we would like to study has not been looked at in this niche of the literature either. So in the interest of time, let me get right into it and show you, although this problem is multidimensional, meaning you could have 3 or more types of services that's needed at the same time, let me focus on a 2-dimensional version of the problem where you need services from a fire system, a fire station, which is on the horizontal axis, and you need services from an ambulance station, which is covered in the vertical axis. So basically, what this graph is showing you is a model, a representation of response times and the important parameters of the problem. And that is as follows. So on the horizontal axis, you see wherever you are, how long it will take for the fire station from the closest fire station to get to you. And the same thing applies for the vertical axis, respectively, for the ambulance station. And the dashed lines are the targets. If in some cases, such as the China implementation that we worked, the targets are not clearly expressed, so therefore we worked with averages. So the dashed lines are, in terms of the averages, average fire responder time and ambulance responder times that we are trying to target. Now, this is not specific to China. During my work in Canada, I had asked about these targets to a city official in Montreal, and the response I got was, well, Dr. Verter, the fire truck will get there when they get there. So it's not that it's a China-specific concern. I would say in general across the board that these targets, which we represent in this graph with a dashed line, are not very well studied and expressed. Now, of course, if you were the square in region 2, that means that the fire truck fire team gets there faster than the ambulance. So sorry, the ambulance gets there faster than the fire truck. And then if you were in region 3, it's the other way around. So obviously there is some waiting that's happening because they need to be there at the same time for some things to happen. So the 45-degree line is showing that the points where they reach their event location at the same time. So if you're at the star, actually your fire and ambulance response is pretty unacceptable because they are higher from they're higher than the targets, but at least it's well coordinated because I mean they arrive late, but they arrive at the same time. So if you put all of this in the context, you can categorize these response zones into 4 quadrants. And if you were in the outer 3 quadrants with the light shade, those are response times and waiting times representing the lack of coordination are unacceptable. And what you want to be is you want to be in quadrant number 1, which is the lower bottom quadrant. And even then you can go ahead and further categorize the situation. So the quadrant 1 is adequate in terms of the fire and ambulance response. But if you would like to be adequate also in terms of the wait time, meaning the coordination, the level of coordination, then you really want to be in this hexagon that is dark shaded here. And basically these lines 1 and 3 represent the wait time target. I believe that was represented in the previous slide. Yeah, the lines 1 and 3 are the wait time targets. So what you want to be is not only in quadrant number 1, but also in that hexagon. So basically the problem, when you go from a single dimensional covering problem to a multidimensional covering problem, what you're looking at is improving the system by the establishment of additional fire and ambulance response capability so that you move a certain number of points into the hexagon. So the hexagon region we call the preferred zone. These 2 triangles we call the adequate zone, and then the other 3 squares or rectangles we will call the poor response zone. So those are the 3 categories of nodes we have in the system. Now, moving on to the more technical side of the presentation briefly, if I wanted to model this problem as an extended location cover problem, what I would do is that I would define 2 sets of binary variables, y and z, representing the number of nodes or the nodes moved from the poor region into the preferred zone, and the z represents the nodes moved from the adequate region into the preferred zone by my decisions. So at the end, I'm going to count and maximize the total of y and z's. But at the same time, I need a couple of binary variables for my new ambulance and fire stations to be established. And those are O and P. So, basically, the variable xij, which is a multiplication of O and P variables, tells me that if xij is 1, I know that there is a ambulance station in O and a fire station in P. That's the only way xij can be 1. If xij is 0, either there is nothing in OIP or there's only one of them is active. So xij being 1 tells me that I have because I'm now looking at a pair, what we call the pairwise coverage. And then my coverage parameters, capital A and B, shows me that when xij is 1 for a certain node k, I will be able to move that node. So when I have the pair of ambulance and fire stations in I and J, I will be able to move node K from a poor region to a preferred region. And again, similarly, B shows me that if I have both I and J established, then I'll be able to move a node in the adequate region, which was the the two rectangles here in quadrant 1, to the preferred region, that is the hexagon in quadrant 1. With that, I can now extend my classical location coverage formulation to this formulation, and although it would be difficult to show you graphically the 3 or 4 dimensional versions of this formulation implies to you that actually I could easily go from a 2-dimensional coverage formulation to a 3-dimensional coverage formulation if I wanted the police there in addition to the ambulance and fire station, for example. The first 2 sets of constraints are in terms of the new ambulance and fire stations to be established. In the objective function, I'm counting the number of nodes I moved from the poor and adequate region into the preferred region zone. Of course, the constraints 3, 4, and 5 are the linearization of the multiplicative Xij definition. And then the last 2 sets of constraints are about the decision to cover a certain node K that is either in the poor region or in the adequate region by the additional establishment of ambulance and fire stations. This is not an easily scalable formulation. So we have adapted we have developed and implemented a genetic algorithm to solve this. So I'm gonna turn to the implementation of this approach in Chengdu City, China. And of course, I should mention that in the case of the hazardous materials response, in terms of hazardous materials, you obviously need a third service, which is the hazardous materials specific response teams, but the initial response is still provided by the fire and ambulance stations. So what happens is that the fire station gets there and starts containing the site, not necessarily responding to the fire because they don't exactly know the chemical that is on fire. So they need to wait the trained hazmat specialists and team in their heavily protected gear to arrive. But you need the fire team there, the city fire team there to contain the area. And the ambulance response is to basically then transfer the evacuated people to an emergency department if necessary. For those of you who are not familiar with the Chinese geography, at the bottom right, you see the Xinjiang province, and Chengdu City is the capital of the Xinjiang province. That's what we are dealing with. Now, the road network in Chengdu City could be represented using about 1,300 nodes, but it is important to highlight that we're not using the regular city network because this is an urban area. And as you will see in the next slide, what you will see here is that the dark solid areas are the hazmat network that we have generated by processing these nodes and arcs to make sure that hazardous materials trucks do not pass within 800 meters of the schools, as an example of the sensitive areas. So as a result, as you would see from this, almost all of the downtown area is outside the hazardous materials road network because many of the 325 plus schools are in that area. And this graph also shows you in the triangles the existing fire stations and in the circles the existing ambulance stations. We have 62 ambulance stations and 20 fire stations in the system. And based on this, basically what you would realize is that a little less than half of the zones in the city or the nodes in the city, meaning 294 nodes are only in the preferred domain. The rest is, more nodes are actually in more than 300 nodes are actually in the poor response zone in terms of a coordinated response from the ambulance and fire teams. So we wanted to improve this by using our approach on this system. And when you do that, first of all, the first two rows here shows the number of new ambulance and fire stations to be established. And since there is 62 ambulances and 20 fire stations, the first column is when we don't make any investments into new stations, but we relocate some of them. And as you could see, this first column gives an indication as to the suboptimality of the existing network, because basically, if we were to optimize the system without any additional stations, we would be able to move 28 zones from adequate to the preferred zone. So the optimized current system with some relocations will involve the averages of the response time for ambulances in terms of minutes, the fires, and the wait time. Now, if we added 5 new fire stations, you would see that the result here, there would be, of course, very little impact, almost no impact on the ambulance response, but then you would improve the fire station response, and you would actually you'd be able to improve the coordination in a significant way. So basically, the wait time goes a little, around 2.5 minutes when you are adding 5 new fire stations to the existing number of fire stations, which seems to be somewhat relatively less than the ambulance stations. I'll finish with this slide, which shows the value of the coordination and when it brings some value, the type of coordination we're talking about to the table. Now, if you were to if you wanted to add 5 new fire stations and 5 new ambulance stations, in this column, we are showing you how you would have done it using sequential decision making. Okay, so you will solve a covering problem with only 5 additional fire stations. You take that solution, you put it into another covering problem and add 5 more ambulance stations, and this is what you'll end up with. So as you would see, the impact of 5 new ambulance stations and 5 new fire stations, when it is addressed or designed in an integrated fashion as the way we proposed, actually at that level, the impact is not that great, okay? But if you scale up the problem, so rather than going to, rather than adding 5 and 5, if you wanted to add 10 and 10, and these are arbitrary numbers just to show the value of integrated decision making, which is we know, but it's we wanted to show the extent of it here. The idea here is that actually, if you compare the last column with the second column, you'll see that there's a significant number of additional nodes moved from poor region to the preferred region, and actually in terms of the impact, so the impact from adequate to preferred region is not that significant, but in terms of improving service to poor regions, you can do a lot better with an integrated design approach. With that, I will turn it over back to Carla. As mentioned, the discussion at the end will be more on a panel format on more general questions. So if you had very specific questions about this work, you can certainly address them to me at verter@msu.edu. Thanks, Carla.
Carla, you're muted.
Sorry, I did it again. Okay, thanks, Vedat. It seems to me that this type of modeling is highly relevant to many other issues of response management, although the complexity also increases as one needs more and more products and services within the response system. Again, any questions for Vedat should please be put into the question and answer period. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the last speaker, Jackie Griffin of Northeastern University. Jackie received her PhD in industrial engineering from Georgia Tech and is now an associate professor of mechanical and industrial engineering. She is also the director of the IE and OR faculty at Northeastern University. Jackie's research focuses on the development of new models and methods to address the complexities of decision-making in healthcare systems, as well as in the management of humanitarian systems. Today, Jackie will be speaking about drug shortages and medical supply chains through the lens of the UN's sustainability goals. Thank you, Jackie, for agreeing to give this talk. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here today. And I'm following two great presentations. So again, as noted, my name is Jackie Griffin. I'm an associate professor at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. And today I'm really going to discuss with you, we have a broad research group really thinking about drug shortages. How do we focus on mitigation? How do we better understand what's really driving these? And I wouldn't want to start without actually recognizing the rest of my team members. The first four are kind of my co-PIs, the other professors. We've enjoyed the fact that this is truly an interdisciplinary team that brings together individuals from computer science, psychology, game design, computer engineering. And then we've had a variety of PhD students who have come and really worked on this project over the years, 3 of which have already graduated. So wanted to and then, of course, let's acknowledge the partial support from the United States National Science Foundation on this research as well. So I'm going to give a little background on kind of the drug shortage problem. It's often one that is less well known, although I would say that within the last year, certainly with the COVID pandemic, I think many individuals have really become more aware of the restrictions, capacity limitations, and challenges that are really at the core of supplying our medical facilities. And so here I've just pulled together 3 different headlines that have come out in 2020, really talking about what's going on with drug shortages specifically related to COVID-19. And we see that that when a product was originally found to be potentially beneficial, we saw a rush of healthcare centers across the United States, across the globe, really rushing to buy those. And without much, we're seeing the consequential repercussions throughout the entire system. Those drugs typically were also used for treating other conditions and other diseases. And so therefore, there are a lot of these complexities where we see that people trying to address one problem are really creating substantial problems elsewhere. And as I'm going to get to, what we've looked at as our team is really trying to look at the role of the decision makers. Much of the research in supply chain disruptions has focused on the structures of the supply chain, redundancies in the supply chain, which certainly are critical. But what we've really found in our exploration of drug shortages is that we really need to think about the mental models, the strategies that individuals scattered throughout the supply chain, many different stakeholders really play in kind of the dynamics that we see play out. And really understanding that is going to be the key of actually fixing this problem. So while we have certainly seen this in COVID, this is certainly, drug shortages are a chronic challenge. On the chart over here, you can see over the last 6 years, you can see this is within the United States, the number of drug shortages that have been on record with the FDA. There are multiple ways to define drug shortages. And if you go to some other organizations, the numbers actually might be higher. And it's important to remember drug shortages oftentimes can actually last multiple years as well. So even if we see a new drug shortage in a year, the consequences of that can often last and affect patients. So why are we tackling this problem? Hopefully it's already apparent, but drug shortages cause challenges and cause real consequences on multiple fronts. First, we know it leads to poor outcomes, especially when Unlike other supply chains, oftentimes when we're talking about health and medical products, we do not have the luxury of choosing to wait until that product is available to continue our operations or our services. Additionally, in many of these cases, there is just not a substitute product that is equivalent. And substitute products oftentimes are worse efficacy and also possibly higher costs or worse side effects for that particular patient. So we see the poor patient outcomes. Also on the right, you can also see just within the structure of healthcare management, we see substantial costs that are incurred by healthcare organizations from managing these drug shortages on a day-to-day basis. So in a 2018 survey of 700 hospital pharmacy managers, 70% said that on at least 50 occasions in the past year, they weren't able to provide a doctor with the drug that was needed to treat that patient. That's approximately 1 per week. And we also know that it takes a toll and really adds these costs to the management of these systems. And many hospitals, you're finding that their pharmacy supply chain team spends 80% of their time just dealing with the shortages, just fighting these fires on a day-to-day basis. And we have a close collaboration with Mass General Hospital, where we've been exploring this more recently as well, and really trying to better understand the tax. And then finally, there's certainly literature that demonstrates that drug shortages do not affect all populations across the globe or even within a region similarly. And there are naturally inequities in access during shortages. And so this is how kind of it starts to really address the UN sustainability goals. We're talking about health, economic growth, reduced inequalities. And the challenge of this problem is that it really is multifaceted and it is a complex problem with many moving pieces. There are market factors, economic factors, information exchange is a key component, a lot of uncertainties in demand and supply. We can also get to manufacturing capacity and quality, which again hits on this concept of industry and innovation and infrastructure. Quality manufacturing facilities are a key component as well into preventing these drug shortages, especially when we're talking about product recalls. And so we've jumped in and spent a lot of time really thinking about this problem. The supply chains are complex and really there can be disruptions across the board. We've had many instances where we really can see that the pharmaceutical supply chains are not designed to be resilient to disruptions. We saw massive challenges after Hurricane Maria, particularly in saline, which is a very simple product, but it's also a very and a very inexpensive product, but truly critical to so many surgeries and so many processes. And most of the US manufacturing facilities were located in Puerto Rico. We saw substantial effects from that. What further makes this challenging is the fact that when we look at the FDA's website, for about half of the shortages that are reported, only 50% are labeled as having an unknown cause. And having an unknown cause makes it very difficult to identify where do we actually invest in changing this problem. And further, as we've really researched this and there's been plenty of reports, a lot of anecdotal evidence is suggesting that the role of stakeholders' decision-making processes plays an important role in this system. We've done some analysis of historical data to further understand the complexity beyond just the decision makers who are scattered across the entire global system. We also know that there's network and structural complexities that further drive the effects and consequences that we're seeing. So we took with 6 years of data, we looked at all the shipments of antibiotic oncology drugs, 2 classes of drugs who are very likely to have drug shortages. And we actually looked at who are the distributors that are actually, so we focused on the United States here. We actually saw just by looking at the United States, we were able to look at all the shipments and we were able to see which of the 4 main distributors were shipping most of the products. And here you can see there are spatial challenges. And the reason this matters is that if a disruption happens in one particular distributor, it's going to affect different parts of the country in different ways. And this problem just becomes exacerbated as we move up to a global scale. And truly understanding the nature of this is going to help us be able to understand if a disruption happens, what are the likely consequences, and is going to affect how we actually have to intervene. Beyond the spatial complexities, we obviously have temporal complexities. With that same data set, we ran used some data mining techniques to really study and try to understand no longer try to look at interdependencies between different products that are in a similar class. So here we have 4 different antibiotic, and we can see that we see very similar temporal patterns. Getting to that concept of substitutability that I mentioned before. If you're seeing similar patterns in kind of the drug shortages for different products, that's going to further exacerbate the problem of actually treating our patients, treating them in a cost-effective and in a just effective manner. So we have taken this data approach of really trying to take this data from IQVIA and really try to better understand what does the distribution system look like within the United States, understanding kind of the variability. But one of the key components our team has really been focused on, again, is trying to think at the decision makers at the healthcare centers. Many researchers have focused on, can we change the network structure? And I think that that's critical research. But we have found that we think that people making hoarding decisions, even at a very small scale across multiple healthcare centers, are going to accumulate and cause substantial network effects. And that's really what we're trying to understand. And we believe that we need to have a better understanding of these decision-making and behavioral models among the stakeholders. And we need to really embed those within our supply chain and operations research network models. And this just gives you an idea. There are critical challenges at all levels of the supply chain, but this is just focused on the eventual healthcare center. And I think the healthcare center and how they have to address the effects of shortages is often an overlooked component. They have many critical decisions to make. Again, classic supply chain engineering, ordering policies, inventory and shortage policies, product substitution, thinking about rationing and allocation. But there are many challenges that are really faced that are going to affect how they make those decisions. They have to constantly balance supply uncertainties. And it's important to remember that if you're running a hospital, you're not talking about 5 different products. You're talking about perhaps 1,000 or thousands of products that you're trying to make these decisions about all at the same time. Demand uncertainties, certainly we've seen demand uncertainties change with COVID-19. And a key component that we've started to look at is, how do people make decisions based on their history of relationships with their suppliers? So how does trustworthiness, reliability of suppliers, if that is to affect decision-making, how do we kind of see the ultimate effects of that? And really looking at that interaction, making sure to embed that within our models. So what we have found that within the literature is that the behavioral aspects of supply chain resiliency remain understudied, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector. As I mentioned before, there are unique features to the pharmaceutical sector that we don't see in other supply chain disruptions. So one area of supply chain disruption is disruptions or recalls in food supply chains. And while that is a critical problem that needs to be looked at, typically if a product is recalled, we have many other options of what we can kind of eat instead. In this case, if you have only a few manufacturers and a product is recalled, you oftentimes do not have another option. And it really leads to this immediacy and this sense of firefighting, especially for those on the ground trying to treat patients. So what we've looked at is a simulation framework focused on instantiating and testing supply chain resiliency, really accounting for the human components of the system. And key to this research is really our interdisciplinary team. I just want to make sure I'm okay on time here. I'll try and speed it up. What we've done is, this is the general framework. We have kind of 3 components, and they're connected by our operations research flow simulation at the core. But we have 2 different components. One is that we believe that there's not a very good data on really understanding how people make these decisions. If the data is there, it's very hard to access. And so what we've done is we have a professor of game design who has actually worked on creating what we call a gamette. It's a short game. It's a combination of game and vignette, where we want to actually embed people, human in the loop, to actually make these decisions, capture the data about how they process information, what they're experiencing, so that we can create better models of how individuals actually respond in the supply chain. And then the other component that I'll spend a little more time on is on kind of the PsychSim side. This is a PsychSim simulation, was already a methodology. It has a Markov decision process at the core of it. And one of the leaders who actually created this is a key component of our team. So I can, there you go. So I won't go into too much detail about the gamettes, but we have had really interesting results of trying to see how slight changes to the system features can actually lead to repeated significant differences in how we're seeing people make decisions. Knowing how they make decisions is going to be critical to us actually being able to address and mitigate this problem. So I put some pictures of the gamette, and I would be happy to share the link if anyone wants to play themselves. We have some really exciting results I didn't get a chance to put in here, but we're really seeing these interesting trends we're seeing that players who interact with a different type of agent, so if the individual they're interacting with makes different decisions in a different way, we start to see kind of this deviation in behavior. And this actually parallels nicely what I'm going to show you in a second. So what we've really looked at is embedding this concept of theory of mind with PsychSim modeling within our network structure. My quickest explanation of theory of mind is a modeling method which actually tries to model reasoning about how other individuals within the system think. So not only do I think about what you might do, I instead create a mental model of how I think that you make decisions and how you reason, and allow that to inform the decisions that I make. So each entity is simulated as a boundedly rational agent who has their own objective, which they're trying to optimize. And they have a look ahead period, which they actually simulate forward when actually trying to make those decisions. And so I haven't I've left out the details of all the mathematics here, happy to discuss. So we really wanted to look at thinking about if different agents in our models have slightly different behaviors, how is that going to affect the ultimate system dynamics? So here you can see that we're going to have a disruption only at one manufacturer, and correspondingly they'll affect different distributors, but both health centers are eventually treated by them. We do look at different disruption types and have found really interesting results regarding how differently the system behaves, even just the disruption characteristics change. And we have limited here the types of decisions that can be made. Distributors can use a base stock policy, can choose to allocate their inventory with a proportional or preferential to one of the healthcare centers. Similarly, the healthcare centers can choose to place their orders either equally among the two distributors, or they can do it based on trustworthiness. We're trying to understand responsiveness based on order fill rate.
Jackie?
Yes.
2 minutes?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So we've looked at really understanding the role of trustworthiness in decision making, and we've looked at different models that we can use to actually relate to this. So here we can look at how we've modeled trustworthiness within our PsychSim agents, and we are having it be affected both on how much is delivered and whether they meet the expectations of what's been ordered. So on-time delivery rates. And so we've looked at 2 different models. One is symmetric, but we've actually seen a lot of literature to say that people actually lose trust faster than they gain trust back. And so we have also looked at these asymmetric models of trust updating. And one of the going back to the concept of equity, I said at the beginning, one of the key things we found is actually perhaps not as expected, asymmetric models seem to actually lead to better system behaviors. We actually see more equity in the cost incurred by different distributors, different manufacturers, and actually improves the overall supply chain in the simulation models that we've learned. That actually this behavior of kind of being pessimistic about regaining trust actually can help. And we've dug into the details to really understand. Here you can see that you really have these behaviors that jump around both in terms of our the orders that are placed, also in the backlog and the inventory in the system. And so we really think that we see these different waveforms that occur based on changing in how the individuals at the core of the system make these decisions. And so this has really demonstrated to us that if we want to think about mitigating this problem, we need to make sure that we are really understanding how people are making the decisions, because the optimal way that you would intervene changes substantially, even in these simple models. So we've been thinking about coordination between health centers and distributors. How can you actually incentivize this? Thinking a lot about information exchange, and part of our collaboration with Mass General Hospital is really embedding ourselves and understanding the types of information that are given to the hospital pharmacy managers so that we can better think about how we can support that going forward.